Hello, and welcome to this presentation on what do property developers do, presented by Property Development Institute. When you look at a city in any part of the world, you can see property development everywhere. Property development isn't just about building an apartment building or building an office building. It's about building everything that we use within society. So that can be residential, commercial, industrial, infrastructure projects, entertainment, you name it. It is all property development. And that's the beauty of what we do. Everywhere we look in a city, you see property development. And property development ranges from the renovation of a property to the creation of a completely new asset. It can include the refurbishment, it can be a knockdown rebuild, it can be creation of new infrastructure, and quite often development can go ahead unseen. So, for example, here in Sydney Harbour, you can't see that there is a cross-harbour tunnel that goes beneath the harbour there. So development is a critical aspect of what we do. In simple terms, property developers create cities. This is what every single aspect of what we do does. It creates cities, a home, a place to work, a means to travel. It's all property development and relates to everything that we do in our societies. So what is property development? Well, property development requires us to operate as a business. So property development is a business. It's not something that you sort of do part-time. It can be sort of, doing it on the weekends if you're at home, but I wouldn't classify that as part-time because you do have to focus on it. It takes time out of your working day. So it is a micro business. As you get larger and do two properties, maybe a duplex or some villas or some townhouses or a small scale apartment building, suddenly you're starting to increase the size of your developments. It does become a full-time job and you have to be right on top of all the matters that relate to what property development is. So as a property developer, we can change the use of the land. So there might be cattle roaming on a parcel of land, and that can be subdivided into housing lots and then houses built on it, for example. It's changing the use from agriculture to housing. Why do we do it? We do it because of the financial aspects, the profit and potentially loss if there's risk that's not properly mitigated. So we take risk, and our return for taking risk is the profit. But sometimes things can go wrong, and if you don't manage your risks properly, you can make a loss. So it's a very important aspect to remember is that you can lose money in property development unless you educate yourself on how to manage risk and what is involved in actually being a property developer. So what's our goal? Well, our goal is to achieve the highest and best use of a property. Now, that means we've got to consider any physical constraints on the land, any legal constraints, so that might be the town planning rules, and financial constraints, your ability to have equity to create that project, to borrow money, to have debt, you get the debt that is needed. So not only is it the lay of the land or the lie of the land, pardon me, the physical attributes, whether it's forested or whether it's vacant land, it's been cleared, might be on the side of a cliff, very steep. All these things have to come into play from the physical perspective, and then obviously legally. So legally, we're going to look at, all of the things. Planning, the planning issues are obviously the biggest issue. But within our process, there's a lot of legal documentation that also has to happen. So you have to be aware of what the legal constraints are in being able to create a property development. And the financial, obviously, as I've already mentioned. But probably the biggest single thing that we really have to be aware of is creating value for the stakeholders. Now, just because you're the developer doesn't give you the right to do everything you want. So being a stakeholder, meeting your stakeholders' needs is obviously important. So, for example, council, just because you might want to build a 20-story building doesn't mean that the authorities will think that that's appropriate. So knowing and understanding what all of your stakeholders' needs are is really critical to coming up with an appropriate outcome. So how do property developers develop property? Well, what we do is we change the use. I've mentioned that before. We're going to change the use of the land. We can subdivide it, carve it up, as I mentioned before, take a piece of land and cut it into smaller pieces, and then build houses or factory units or something of that nature on it. Or we can take fragmented ownership, being lots of small parcels, and put them all back together to make a larger parcel of land for us to develop. We can also do this with airspace. So not only are we talking about land, now we are starting to talk about air rights and even underground rights. So understanding all these different aspects of what development is and what we do becomes important. And you only learn this through educating yourself about what property development's all about. And I've also earlier mentioned about, improving land. So refurbishing, renovations, alterations, additions, the extensions, knocking down and rebuilding, repurposing, even changing the use of a property, which is what we already mentioned. These are all aspects of property development that we deal with. So if you think about it, we all live in a house, a villa or a townhouse apartment, something of that nature, housing. And because we all live in some form of housing, it just gives you that whole understanding of how important property development is. So we create housing for people to live in. We create office buildings for people to work in. We create things like the Sydney Opera House for people to go to entertainment venues. There's all sorts of different infrastructure projects, hospitals, schools, bridges, tunnels, opera houses, libraries. All these things are property development, developed by government for their equivalent to profit would be the public betterment, being able to attract tourism, things of that nature. So there are different aspects to the way that the public sector will develop, but the private sector will also develop for profit. So who am I? Well, I've been around the industry for 40 years now. So my name's Steve Chandler. I run Property Development Institute. I also operate a property development training advisory and strategy company, consultancy firm. Plus I develop property as well. So I have a number of different things that I do. I'm very active in my industry, and it was this activity in the industry and people saying to me, how can I be a property developer, that actually led me into creating Property Development Institute and sitting down and putting a structure to what it is and sort of systemising what it is that property developers do. So over the last 40 years, I've learned a hell of a lot. I started in the construction industry, had 20 years in construction. Mind you, during those 20 years, I was doing little developments all the way along the road, and then turned to development just over 20 years ago now for myself. So it's absolutely fantastic. It's something that I recommend that everybody should try, but not until you understand what you're getting yourself into. The property development does require an education. It is not a get rich quick scheme. If you go into it on the basis of, oh, I'm going to get rich quick, you're going to get poor very quick. Instead, you do need to educate yourself. It's like everything else. Any career path that you choose, you must educate yourself on that particular type of career. So, do you need to go to university and do a university degree on property development? I'm not saying that. But what you must do is understand what you are getting yourself into. So education is so important. I say to people all the time, get yourself some free resources. Go and read some books. Go and watch some videos. Be very careful though when you watch videos. You really have to understand who the person is that's telling you how to do this. You've got to know that they're actively, part of the industry. Great way of doing that is, everybody has their resume or their CVs on LinkedIn nowadays. And while I don't like to promote any particular organisation, etc., but LinkedIn is a great place to learn about people's history. You'll find my 40-year history there. So, feel free to look me up on LinkedIn. Even send me a connection request if that's something you would like to do. Just let me know you've watched my video here, and I'd be happy to connect. The key thing that you must do when you're reading a book or watching a video is know that that person is a bona fide property development person. You'll find my history sitting there on LinkedIn. Go and have a look. Also, what's really interesting is that I am a third generation property developer. So my father was a developer. His father was a developer as well. It runs in the blood. It's just an incredibly fascinating industry, and it requires a lot of thought. It is stressful, like everything else. You're dealing with either your own money or other people's money. It's always stressful trying to A, keep that money, and B, grow that money. So it's quite exciting. I think you'll really enjoy a career in property development. What's our primary role? Well, as a developer, I sit there and I go, well, I get my crystal ball out and I look at what's happening in the world. And I know that I have no idea what's going to happen tomorrow. I have no idea what's going to happen next week, next month, next year, or at some time in the future. So how is it that I can go, yep, I'm going to invest X millions of dollars into a project where payday might not happen for 3 years? Well, to be able to do that, you really have to have an understanding of the risks that apply to doing so. Any business, any large-scale business anywhere, before they invest in a new factory or some new equipment or anything of that nature, they have to look at what is the likelihood of things not going well into the future, or what's the likelihood of not being able to repay the debt, or what's the likelihood of our product no longer being purchased by people. All these things have to be considered by every business, and property development is no different. So what we have to do in very simplistic terms is look at the macroeconomic risks attached to what we're doing. So we're in property, the business of creating property. So macroeconomic things, what's happening globally on a global scale? What's happening within our country, within the state in which we live, within the city that we live in, within the suburb that we're looking to develop in, and then down to the actual locality where we're developing. So that's going from macroeconomic risk down into micro risk. It's location-based risk. And then once we've finished looking at those things, and that's sort of like a funnel where macroeconomic risk is the big thing, and then we're coming down to a really fine point, which is the local area. Then we have to actually look at our project and consider project risks And then we culminate that whole thought process down to people risk, because property development is about people. It's about getting the best out of everyone involved. And during your project, there's a good chance you're going to be dealing with potentially 200 people, depending on the size of your project. But even a little project, you think about it, you're going to have an electrical engineer, a mechanical engineer, a hydraulic engineer. You're going to have a geotechnical engineer. You're going to have your architect. You're going to have whoever's going to do the certification. There's insurance brokers that you're going to deal with to get your insurances, your finance people that you're going to be dealing with, obviously your authorities as well. Gosh, I'm just trying to think off the top of my head. There's just so many different people that you're going to be dealing with. Real estate agents, it's just massive. It's absolutely huge, the type of people. Town planners, again, there's another one. So they're just popping into my mind now as we go along. But there's hundreds of people that you might get involved in, particularly if your project's a bit larger. Now, in the architectural firm, you might be dealing with 3 or 4 people. In the engineering firms, you might be dealing with 3 or 4 people in each of the different engineering firms. It can be a huge team. So getting the best out of people all the time is certainly a major risk, and it is our role to manage that risk. So the first thing we've got to do is identify it. Okay, so we need to be able to identify risk, and we've got to learn that. You don't just go, yep, I know how to identify risk. You've actually got to get experience, and before you even get experience, you've got to get some training. So I mentioned before, read books. That's number one. So read some books. After you've read some books, watch some videos. Make sure you're talking, listening to the right person there. Then you go and do some training, and then you go and get some experience and start small. Go into the bigger projects. I mean, you could even go and work for property development companies. That's another way of getting experience. Get yourself as much knowledge as you can, because knowledge is key. And once you have that knowledge, once you build it up through education, because that's what it is, once you have that education, then you apply it to a process, being a project, your project, an employer's project, whatever that might be. And if you think of property development, it is just a number of what I call fundamental steps. So if you can understand what those key fundamentals are and you master them, you've got it made. Because property development is simply a jigsaw puzzle. That's all it is. It's just a jigsaw puzzle. There are bits and pieces that have to be brought together, and if you can get them all together, it's going to be fantastic. So I have what I call the 5 fundamentals. So I tried to break it down to what those key things are, the key messages. So I call them the fundamentals, and they are being able to acquire a site. So the acquisition process, site acquisition, that's number one. Being able to get the right site for yourself to develop. Feasibility is number 2. It's being able to understand the viability of a project and being able to prove it through written feasibility studies. Authorities, there are a number of different approval processes that you must go through throughout the life of a project. The first one is obviously the most important. That is getting your initial planning or development permit approved by the authorities. That is obviously the first and foremost. But then there's a whole series of other approvals that come past. How do you do that? What politics is involved? How do you minimise the amount of time that it takes to get an approval? How do you manage the risk attached to getting that approval? So all of these type of things, understanding what authorities do and how you manage that process. Probably the biggest single one for me is revenue. In a feasibility study, the biggest number within your feasibility study has to be revenue. Obviously, that is why we're doing it, to create that revenue, and then we're going to have some costs. If the costs are less than your revenue, then you're going to make a profit. So it's really simple. But for revenue, how do you know what to develop? How do you know where to develop it? How do you know what exactly that product is? It's, for example, if you look at apartments, do you develop 1-bedroom apartments, 2-bedroom apartments, 3-bedroom apartments, 4-bedroom apartments? What do you create for people? Well, it has to be based on the demand for the product. So revenue is looked at from a perspective of demand. What do people need? And or if you're in the commercial world, what do businesses need? So if you can meet that need, then there's a product that is necessary in the market. So creating a product that's necessary. Well, what is that product? Well, let's say it was 3-bedroom units for families. Where does it have to be? What size do those apartments have to be? What quality standard? What finishes and fixtures? What sizes are they? What's the minimum needs for? Do we need 2 bathrooms? Do we need 3 bathrooms? What is it that the target market needs for you to provide? So revenue is about understanding that, and then it's the shape, size and shape. What if they're angular? If you've got a strange shape to the parcel of land you want to develop on. Angular buildings might look really attractive from the outside, but try living in a space which has got a really pointy, room in it. You can't use that, space. So being practical and functional also comes into play. So understanding what you can do to create that revenue is one thing. Understanding how you can pocket the cash at the end of the project is another strategy altogether. Delivery is what I classify as the 5th fundamental. That is, meeting your promises. You promise to people you're going to do something. This is what we're going to develop, and you go ahead and you develop that. And it's how you do that, how you engage your consultants, how you engage your construction contractors, all the different things that have to happen, how you engage with everybody along the way, how you build, what the issues are throughout the different building contracts. So there's a number of different building contracts that you can use to get a building built, knowing and understanding what all those different contracts are and what's involved, and whether there's, some are faster than others, but some have more risk than others. So throughout this all these 5 fundamentals, it's being able to identify the risk in every part of the process, and then coming up with a risk minimization strategy, or a mitigation strategy, to try to minimize the likelihood of any form of risk occurring on your project. So site acquisition, let's have a quick look at what the 5 fundamentals are. So there's different methodologies that we use for site acquisition. We can just go and buy a property. We could buy it but not settle for an extended period of time. There's things that we call options, call options, put and call options. We can acquire a site through a development agreement, so you're developing on somebody else's land, or you can do joint ventures with landowners or other developers, or other friends, family, business partners, etc. So there's a whole different array of methodologies that we can use. We talk about real estate agents. Would you or wouldn't you use a real estate agent to help you? At a personal level, I don't believe in using the services of real estate agents when it comes to site acquisition, and there's a whole myriad of reasons why that is, and it's something that maybe one day we can have a chat about. But I definitely have some opinions where that's concerned. Feasibility, 3 different levels of feasibility. We have a high-level feasibility, which we use to filter through site opportunities very quickly. Doesn't take a lot of time. There's only a few pieces of information that need to be entered, so you can do it relatively quickly, and it helps you when you look at a site to go, nah, that's not a good one, let's move on to the next one. Nah, that's not a good one, let's move on to the next one. Yeah, this one could be okay. And when you get to that one that's okay, then you could go, right, I'm going to do a static feasibility, because now you're into that part of considering whether or not that is a site that you want to move forward to with. Now, that would require a lot more information, and you start spending money when it comes to doing a static feasibility, you start getting some inputs from different places. So that becomes more accurate as well. So as we spend more time and money, we start getting more accuracy with our feasibilities. And then, of course, if that static feasibility works, then you can take it to that next level, which is where you're thinking of actually acquiring that property. This is where you would do a cash flow. Now, this requires a lot more due diligence information, which is a lot more input from different people. And it's going to take you a long time to create this cash flow. So you really want to be certain that this is where you want to do your development. So you want to acquire this site. So I would never acquire a site without doing a cash flow. That is critical. If you don't do a cash flow, then you really are maxing out your risk. So by doing a cash flow, you're minimizing your risk. But as with everything, the quality of the inputs that go into your feasibility studies will determine the quality of the output. So in general terms, I might say that my high-level feasibility study might be plus or minus 30%. I might say my static might be plus or minus 20%, and my cash flow might be plus or minus 10%. But everywhere, as I come down from 30 to 20 to 10, I am spending money and time on information and trying to find out what the issues are attached to what I'm doing. Then our authorities was the third fundamental. Your development planning, approval, your application, and then your approval is the first one. Then if you're doing a strata or a condo type development, it's getting that approved. Your construction or your building permit to be able to start, breaking the ground, as they call it. Your approval to carve up the land or carve up the apartment building into the individual lots, the approval to be able to occupy the building, and the registration of the new titles so that you can sell all those new titles, all authority approvals, all different things that need to have a process attached to them. Quite often there is politics attached to some levels of this process, and always there is time. There is a lot of time that gets attached to all these different approvals and understanding what impact that has on your projects, because that time will impact upon your feasibility. So you do need to know and understand what all these things are, the time it takes to get them approved, and what happens if they don't get approved. What is that process? So all part of the education. If you can get your education, know and understand how these processes work in your local area, because they all change. Everywhere you go, it changes. Doesn't matter whether you're in the United States, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, wherever, South Africa, wherever you go, they're all going to be similar but different. And understanding them is critical. Revenue, as I said, the biggest single number in your feasibility, you really do have to understand what it is you're proposing to develop, but more importantly is why. Why are you going to develop that? You must have a very good reason why, being there is a market for it and there's the depth of market. So when we talk about depth of market, we're looking at, if there's a competitor doing something similar, what if he gets all the sales? What are you going to do? Is there more people for you to sell your product to, or is that it? And then you're sitting there with a development that won't sell. So those are sorts of things. So that's understanding your target market. What do they look like? What can they afford? Can you develop it and actually, deliver it for the price that they're willing to pay for it? Are you going to make a profit out of that? It's all these type of things. Pre-selling or pre-leasing, is it necessary for you to sell your product or lease your product before you're allowed to start construction, before your financier will actually lend you money? Do you want to sell before you start borrowing money? Because in 2 years' time, what happens at the back end if you've borrowed money without selling anything, and then in 2 years' time you can't sell? So all about risk and understanding what that risk is in your area? Do people pre-sell or pre-lease in your location? How does that process work? Understanding what your financier's needs are and what is legally permissible is important. If you're pre-selling, a communication strategy. If a purchaser buys something off the plan before you start construction, and construction is going to take 18 months to 2 years, well, you can't just not talk to your purchasers. So it's really important to keep in touch with them and understanding, giving them some understanding of what's happening on the project, what you're doing, where the status is, some photographs, some information about the area that they've purchased, all sorts of things. A communication strategy can help if there's some problems at the back end of the development when you're doing the handing over a set of keys at settlement. It's that communication strategy can actually help you. And as I was just alluding to there, when you get to settlement time, when they have to actually fork out all of the money, the balance of the money that's owing, how do you actually pocket the cash from that? That's the critical thing. So that's what we call settlement risk. What if there's a delay? What if there's a problem? What if they can't raise their funds to be able to settle the transaction? All these sorts of things we want to try and resolve before they happen. And delivery, I mentioned this is about how you're going to deliver on your promises about your project. So what's your plan? Right at the outset, you've got to have a project plan. You've got to identify all the things that are part of your process. Make sure you've got them all documented in a project plan, and that on a monthly basis, you're revisiting them with your risk matrix. So within that project plan, you have to have a risk matrix which identifies all the potential risks that you carry in your project and what you're doing about dealing with them. So understanding risk is critical. Service providers, who do you need? Architects, engineers, builders, insurers, financiers. How do you engage with them? What's that process? But always delivering on your promise, because ultimately you cannot pocket the cash unless you deliver on your promises. I call my 5 fundamentals of property development the Pentagon, the property development Pentagon. And to me, it's a systemized approach to property development. And if you have a systemized approach where you can break it down into 5 key fundamentals and work through each one of them, you'll see in that brief discussion I've just given you of everything, they're all interrelated. Acquiring a site is wonderful, but you can't acquire it unless you understand that it's feasible. So you've got to understand feasibility. And feasibility, you can't create your feasibility unless you understand the revenue aspect, the authority approvals process, because it's time and cost, and how you're going to deliver the project. So you can't do a feasibility without everything else. The authorities, no point having an authorities section unless you've got a development proposition. So you have to understand everything else. Revenue by itself is no good, is useless unless you can deliver your project. So again, you need to understand everything else. And delivery, well, you have to have a project in the first place to be able to deliver it. So they are all interrelated, and delivery informs your feasibility. So everything relates to your feasibility, and feasibility comes back into everything else. So the 5 fundamentals are all integrated. To do this systemized Pentagon approach is making your process simple, makes it easier to understand because it relates to various aspects, and you can, when you're trying to learn the process, just isolate each into a silo and focus on the particular issues that are attached, knowing that as you learn about the other silos, they all interrelate. Your education will expand. So remember, I say this to everybody, property development is a learnt skill. You're not born with it. So everybody, all the big successful property developers and property development companies were all founded by somebody who started with no knowledge. So understanding right from the outset that your education is the key. You must teach yourself property development or learn from others. So it's a learnt skill. You're not born with it. This is something that you have to learn. It's like walking, it's like talking, it's like running, it's like dancing, it's like every other skill that you have right now, you had to learn. Property development is absolutely no different. And what better place to learn from than Australia's best property development training provider in 2020? And we've just been advised at the time of recording this, we are also winning the award again in 2021. So learn from Australia's best property development trainer, and you too can be a property developer. Well, thank you very much for joining me today. We look forward to seeing you at some stage in the future, whether you come and learn from us or you learn from others, doesn't matter. From our perspective, it would be great to have you with us, but we want people in the property development industry, but we want them to come in knowing and understanding what they're getting into. So just reiterating the earlier advice, wherever you go to learn for your property development, understand who it is you're listening to, do your research, find out about their career, make sure they are the real deal. If you're not getting someone who is the real deal, and I'm not talking about advertising, we've done this many billions of dollars worth of property development or anything like that, not interested in that, go and research the individual. Have a look at the person who is actually going to stand at the front of the room, look at their CV, see what experience they've got, understand if they are an industry practitioner, and then make a decision. As I said, would love to have you at Property Development Institute. Please feel free to contact us. Our contact details are on the page, our website, propertydevelopmentinstitute.com, or email us at developer@propertydevelopmentinstitute.com. There's also our phone number in Australia if you wish to call us. Thank you very much.